My name is Dennis Speed, and I want to welcome everybody here today for the LaRouche Pack Saturday Dialogue with LaRouche. And I want to say a couple of things about our presentation today, which will be given by Paul Gallagher from Executive Intelligence Review and from our Leesburg office. The transatlantic world is clearly in a kind of death agony right now. You see it in the case of France. You see it in the case of Great Britain. It's essentially the death of neoliberalism. And the world is in a countdown as to which paradigm is actually going to ultimately win. That is to say, the paradigm of the transatlantic decline, or that expressed by China in particular, as well as Russia, in the form of what is called the New Silk Road or the New World Land Bridge, as we refer to it. Now, the design of the second paradigm is something that we're very familiar with because 29 years ago it was Lyndon LaRouche who began articulating that design from prison in the case of just after the fall of the Berlin Wall, right after November 9th of 1989, and then over the course of the immediate 3-4 year period after that, the idea of the New Silk Road as it later came to be known was also formulated jointly by Lyndon LaRouche, Helga Zepp LaRouche, and persons in China who then began to make that their policy. It was fought out over a long period of time, but in the period of 2013, the president of China offered that the United States would become partners with China and with other nations in pursuing that policy, and that was rejected by the Obama administration. In the past 2 years, the process that we have seen unraveling in the United States involves the presidency of the United States now in the hands of a person, Donald Trump, who is prepared to, in fact, answer in the affirmative to that proposal made by President Xi Jinping, as he is prepared to answer in the affirmative to the proposal by Vladimir Putin that the United States become a partner with Russia in addressing various of the problems internationally, including in the military sphere. So much of this is known to people that have worked with us for a period of time, but what I don't think is clear enough, and what we are trying to make the particular orientation of today, is that there's a countdown going on. And in that countdown, which is an arc over the period between now and President's Day, we, the forces that have been associated with Lyndon LaRouche, either for decades or for many years in some cases of other individuals, recognize that the United States presidency, the presidential system, has to be upgraded by the American people. This is not something that can be done as such by the president. The president can initiate certain things, he can act in certain ways. And I'm not talking about the president, Donald Trump. I'm talking about the presidential system of the United States, which requires that the citizenry act as part of that system. This is what Lyndon LaRouche successfully did in the period between 1976 and 1983, when, as a private citizen, together with those of us who were in his organization at that time, he made policy. And he made policy not only for the United States, but for the world. For that, he was never forgiven by the establishment, who made it very clear that while you can assimilate into certain roles, you're not allowed to make policy. Presently, there is a continuous attempt to evolve a coup against Donald Trump. We have on our website a particular document I'm going to refer to right now, which has been written and it's called Mueller Throws Pile of Crap at Michael Flynn, Media Sucks It Up and Amplifies It. And what the author, Barbara Boyd, does is, and I'll be reading the first and last paragraphs, is to throw cold water on the anxiety-ridden, shall we say, fantasies, what do they call fever dreams? That was the word I was looking for. The anxiety-ridden fever dreams that are being given to the American people and others about the apparent circumstances of Donald Trump's presidency versus the real circumstances of what it is that needs to be accomplished. She takes the issue of the coup. And so I'm going to refer to her first and final paragraphs, and then we'll move directly to the presentation, the primary presentation for today. So she notes that the special counsel, Robert Mueller, made his submission to Judge Emmett Sullivan at 3 p.m. Friday about Michael Flynn. It is a typical Robert Mueller show, seeking to protect out of control agents and lawyers at the U.S. Department of Justice who behaved criminally in this case to justify his own criminal actions and to feed the fake narrative that the president is overall in deep legal kimchi. Mueller's minions do this by smearing again Michael Flynn, repeating the refrain, liar, liar, liar. Even Fox on Friday, in its anti-Trump Shepard Smith segments, was eating up Mueller's cheap and poisonous spew. Clearly, the establishment is very, very freaked out that an actual judge might end this national horror show. I'll just refer. As most know by now, Judge Sullivan is exploring whether Flynn was set up, entrapped, framed for the false statements to which he pled guilty and for which he is scheduled to be sentenced on December 18th. And that will be on Tuesday. I just wanted to reference that. So in the final paragraph of what she has placed up on the website, we don't know what Judge Sullivan will do or whether he will enforce his order concerning releasing relevant documents. We do know that this is an outrage against our system of justice. It is disgusting. It is a full and horrific view of Robert Mueller and the evil he is up to, removing any remaining doubt that could possibly exist anywhere. This is how we now treat a highly distinguished public servant, Michael Flynn, someone who put his life on the line for this country honorably and repeatedly. You see, Mueller and his minions would confess, if forced to, quote, "We just got so enraged when we saw Flynn chanting, 'Lock her up.'" Former U.S. Attorney for Washington, D.C., Joseph DeGeneva, was right in his comments on the Tucker Carlson show Friday night. Flynn never lied. Allowing ourselves to let this be would be our national disgrace. To reverse it, everyone involved at the highest levels of the Obama Justice Department, CIA, and FBI must be prosecuted. Now, the reason I wanted to take the time to refer to that is that 9 weeks from this weekend, we'll be holding a conference in Morristown, New Jersey. We'll be saying a lot more about this conference. This will be the first conference of its type that we've held in 15 years. And the issue is that we recognize that there is a need to upgrade our organizational functioning in a qualitative way in order to be able to respond to the problem of having to upgrade the organizational functioning of the United States citizenry. Presently, the citizenry has largely attempted at least to disappear from history again, to disappear from any serious assistance to the presidency. This is not merely a question of whether you're so-called pro-Trump. It's a question of whether you're pro-United States presidency. And the problem involved is that we've got to have a way that our citizens understand what that presidential policy must be. Specifically, the economic policy that we have to advocate, which is the primary basis upon which to change the situation in the country, is what Paul Gallagher and others at Executive Intelligence Review have been working on. Paul, of course, has also been working on Capitol Hill. Notably, though, I want to point out to people that may not know this, that Paul Gallagher was the representative, the spokesman for the Fusion Energy Foundation the day after March 23rd, 1983, when President Ronald Reagan adopted Lyndon LaRouche's policy, which is beam weapons policy. He called it the SDI. That is, Reagan called it the Strategic Defense Initiative. But it was Paul Gallagher that went on the various television stations, NBC and so forth at the time, because he was one of the few people in the United States that was capable and available to tell the American people what the SDI was. We didn't ask to go on, we were requested to go on. And that's exactly what will happen on the question of economic policy. That's exactly what needs to happen in this country, or will happen in this country, when the crisis moment around the economic crisis of the United States comes about. You know, when you are broken down on the highway, you don't care what nationality the mechanic is that comes to fix your car. You don't care about how his breath smells. What you care about is he able to fix your car? And so what we need is to be able to get a lot of Americans, including people around us, to be able enough to understand how, under a circumstance where suddenly the mechanism of power seems to seize up, we're able to get it going again. That's always what Lyndon LaRouche did with this organization, and it's what we have to do with it now. So without further introduction, I want to introduce Paul Gallagher and let him take it from here. So Paul.
Dennis, thank you. With this mobilization for the national conference that you spoke about, with the included focus of giving the policy name of a new Bretton Woods to an agreement that we must get the United States to make, we must get the president to make with the leaders of at least Russia, China, and India now. I want to look at these two paradigms that Dennis referred to, the neoliberal, the one which is, as he said, in the process of blowing up yet again, and the paradigm represented by the New Silk Road and by the policy of full development of the productivity and powers of the human being, which the Schiller Institute has put forward and which is rooted in the American system of economics as a very full version of this paradigm, if we appreciate it. Right at the end of his life, President Franklin Roosevelt in 1945 succeeded in something he had been working on for years before that, in holding a conference in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and getting the international agreement of a large number of countries to a system that became known as the Bretton Woods credit and monetary system. What this system did is it, first of all, fixed the values of most currencies in the world to that of the dollar, and fixed the value of the dollar to a gold reserve, meaning that most countries, particularly in their major categories of trading, their major commodities and machinery that they were trading, would be using the dollar for that purpose, and that at the periods in which imbalances had arisen between countries, one country had a sizable deficit and the other one a sizable surplus, that would be settled in gold by the presentation of dollars from the surplus country to the deficit country, which would settle them by paying them in gold. So that was a gold reserve system in which the dollar became the real reserve, the other value of the other currencies, with the notable partial exception of the British pound and the colonial currencies associated with it. The other currencies were fixed to the dollar. Secondly, that system virtually brought to a halt the speculative trading in currencies in order to bet on their values. It essentially stopped for a period of about 25 years the speculative flow of capital across national borders in order to speculate in anything from real estate to the to the debt of companies. And it created the World Bank as what was intended to be a very large capacity of these countries using their various currencies, remembering that those currencies were stable in relation to one another, that the World Bank would lend those currencies out in large volumes for development projects, particularly in developing countries, as well as for reconstruction in European countries that had been badly damaged by the war. And the image that both the United States Roosevelt administration framers and also others in that conference, the image of the World Bank that they associated with the World Bank above all worldwide was that of the Tennessee Valley Authority and the spectacular success of the TVA in turning what had been by far the poorest area of the United States into an area of rising wages, rising productivity, industrial growth, agricultural growth, and overall progress at a rate which exceeded that of the rest of the country. That TVA was, as one economist called it, the focus of the new imperialism, which the Bretton Woods represented for the rest of the world, that is TVA, imperialism. That was the image of it. Another element of this system was that the United States, having already been protected by bank separation by the Glass-Steagall law, the major European countries which participated in the Bretton Woods system also passed essentially copies of the Glass-Steagall law, bank separation laws, in the period 1945 to 1947. And they, in turn, protected their commercial banking systems from the dangers of speculation, in order that they could be used for this kind of cross-border real investment in productivity and in infrastructure and in development. And the result for the 25 years which followed, despite problems which developed with the Bretton Woods system, the result is called even today by economists the golden age of American productivity, 1945 to 1970. It is, generally speaking, a period in which was characterized by not only rising productivity and rising technological productivity or total factor productivity at a rapid rate, but also by wage growth, by reconstruction, by technological progress, by a great deal of construction of basic infrastructure. Obviously, in the European countries which were being reconstructed from the war, this kind of progress would be fairly obvious. But this is the way the period of the 1945 to 70, the results that it had in the United States, and why it is called that, the golden age of American productivity, up through the period of the adoption and implementation of the Apollo project, the space exploration mission for infrastructure for the United States, which had a transformative effect in the 1960s. In the early 1970s, beginning in August of 1971, that system was destroyed. It was destroyed consciously by decisions made to attack it in the City of London, and by both the Bank of England, the Privy Council in the British government, and the London-centered banks made direct attacks on the rules of the Bretton Woods system, circumvented the rules regarding currency speculation, were allowed to circumvent the rules regarding the cross-border flow of speculative funds, particularly dollars, into London and then out of London, and by various means brought this system down. The Lyndon LaRouche, by forecasting in the early 1960s the processes by which this could and possibly would happen, the processes by which the British would destroy Bretton Woods, became overnight, in August of 1971, a widely noted economist. By then, following that up immediately by forecasting what the result of the destruction of Bretton Woods would be, namely, and he said this within days of August 15th, 1971, when the dollar went off gold reserve, by forecasting that wage controls would follow, that deep austerity would follow, that even fascist forms of austerity would follow, and the depression eventually would follow. By those forecasts, LaRouche went rapidly from being a widely noted economist all of a sudden to being the leading economist enemy of Anglo-American economists, London and New York centered, and MIT and Chicago schools centered teaching of economics. That then focused its animosity on LaRouche from that point onward, particularly from the famous debate that took place between him and Columbia and Abel Lerner, a leading neoliberal economist at that time, in 1971. So the destruction of that Bretton Woods system very rapidly from the early 1970s on, and we have a video which was recently posted on our LaRouche PAC website, which shows this very graphically and briefly, but shows it to everyone's satisfaction, that wages declined from that, real wages declined from that point on. Productivity declined from that point on. Investment in infrastructure declined from that point on. The employment in manufacturing, employment in productive jobs in the United States declined from that point on. Investment in the space program declined from that point on very rapidly. This had profound effects, which over the nearly 50 years since have led to a country with a declining life expectancy, astonishingly, for the last 3 years, the United States having a declining overall life expectancy for the entire population, and to people who were formerly productive and should be among the most productive contributors to our economy and our society, killing themselves in increasing numbers with drugs and other forms of addiction and other forms of the behavior of despair, with drug overdose deaths alone rising on the order of 10 to 15% every year during this 21st century. That deindustrialized process is what came ultimately from that destruction of the Bretton Woods system and the so-called golden age of productivity that it had caused. What happened was financialization, that is, immediately with the destruction of Bretton Woods, the shift to policies of favoring financial speculative investment, favoring investment in real estate, for example. Tax favoring was one major way of doing this, favoring investments into speculation of various kinds, making the profit levels in those speculative investments higher, making investments therefore in industry, in infrastructure, in science and technology more difficult by comparison and competition. Then from the mid-1980s on in particular was added deregulation, and particularly deregulation of banking. This also started in London with the so-called Big Bang, sorry, it should have been Big Bang. They called it the Big Bang deregulation in London in the middle 80s, where they deregulated the banks in every way simultaneously, therefore the name Big Bang, and were then imitated by the other industrial countries. By the early 1980s, specifically 1984, the Glass-Steagall bank separation acts of the various European countries were revoked and replaced by, across Europe, by action of the European Union, replaced by what's called the universal banking model, where the banks are absolutely free to use the deposits from their large deposit bases for their investment banks, the hedge funds they own, all the other speculative divisions that they have. The universal bank became the sole model in the European countries from the early 1980s on. The United States hung on with Glass-Steagall regulation for some years afterwards and then gave it up. And then particularly from the early 1990s on, environmentalism, ecology, restrictions on economies, ecological austerity was added to this, to the point that we now see these thousands and thousands of people in Poland at this meeting in Katowice, Poland, talking about the need to immediately turn the coal mining areas of all of Europe and the United States and India and China and so forth, turn them all immediately, within a decade at most, into nature parks, and shut down all of the production in them, and retrain all the people who are working in those areas as guides, shall we say, who will take people around these nature parks. If you think I'm exaggerating, this is exactly what is being proposed as necessary over the next 10 to 12 years only, supposedly in order to stop the end of the world as a result of climate change. This is only the most recent, most extreme statement of a whole series of austerity measures which have sought to impose the idea that we pollute the earth, that we are fundamentally a contribution to the entropy of the universe, we, the human race, that is, that to stop polluting it, to stop polluting it rapidly, we must eat less, we must travel less, we must work less, we must produce less, and in general, we must have much poorer and less interesting lives, because that will be the best way for us to pollute less. This is nothing but another form, and perhaps recently the most violent form of austerity being imposed in this period of financialization and deregulation and ecologism, which has, but in stages, succeeded the Bretton Woods system after the British destroyed it. Free trade and deindustrialization have also been a hallmark of this, especially as capital became completely free to move and invest either speculatively or otherwise anywhere in the world without any barriers, and therefore could easily move industry from any place where it had been set up with the necessary economic infrastructure to support it, and move it instead into a lower wage area where that infrastructure was lacking, where it would be less productive, but where it would be more profitable for that international capital, because it was basing itself on lower wages. Taken together, these things these policies constitute the neoliberal policy which Dennis was referring to, or the neoliberal paradigm. Now, I go through that in part because it is crucial to understand now, in what we're trying to do in terms of a new Bretton Woods agreement and the initiation of it by the United States. It's crucial to understand that our president, President Trump, came into office a committed opponent of free trade, a committed opponent of ecologism, and particularly of austerity being imposed in the name of ecology, and otherwise a committed opponent of the deindustrialization which have occurred in this period in the last 40 to 50 years in the United States and Europe. And there is at the same time now a revolt which began with Brexit, which has progressed through one national revolt after another, of one of which was the election of Donald Trump, a revolt against that paradigm, and particularly against the austerity which goes along with it. And the president has sought to place himself very firmly in the camp of this revolt at every chance. In fact, he has put himself forward as the international leader of it. I give you only two examples. The fact that he, an Italian parliamentarian who was a guest of mine in Washington recently for meetings, stressed this, that the president went out of his way at the most recent G7 meeting to welcome and to hold a joint press conference with the new Prime Minister of Italy, who was a complete unknown until he became the Prime Minister of Italy, Giuseppe Conte, who was a university professor. Doesn't seem like a President Trump's type, but nonetheless, he held a joint press conference with him, predicted that U.S.-Italian relations would be excellent under his leadership and Prime Minister Conte's leadership, and otherwise gave him a much higher profile than he would otherwise have had. Now, much more sharply recently, the president has placed himself firmly on the side of the revolt against the ecological or energy taxes, or let's say the revolt in France against the entire austerity government and geopolitical government of Macron in France, that revolt was triggered by environmental taxes, by taxes on energy, which were the last straw of the decline of living standards over that long period of time, and the decline of real wages of the middle class and working class and lower poor working class in France, which led to the revolt, which led to the back down, rather humiliating back down of President Macron, which has not, in fact, stopped the revolt. It did lead to howls from the German press in particular that Macron was turning France into another Italy by allowing this kind of anti-austerity revolt to appear to succeed. That is exactly what the policy of the new Italian government has been. President Trump then immediately intervened and said he was delighted to see that the Paris Accords were now being rejected by the entire French population, and that the French president had gone along with his population in taking back the austerity tax measures demanded by the Paris Accords of 2015. So this is an unusual president who does not wish to have any truck with these pillars of the neoliberal paradigm. And at the same time, it's been clear since he took office that he wants to deal, even if in his view, these deals have to be very tough deals in his image of himself as a tough business dealer. Nonetheless, he wants these deals to be with those major nations which have not been part of that neoliberal paradigm, which have not taken part. Russia, China, India. China is a mixed case in that regard, but nonetheless, in his view, those nations which have gone ahead with industrialization, which have gone ahead with scientific progress, which have gone ahead with measures aimed at reducing poverty and building up a large middle class, those nations he wanted to make deals with, no matter how tough he may have thought those deals had to be. Other nations, no. Certainly not nations like the recent governments of France and Germany. So this has made him the target. The fact that these nations include Russia in particular has made him the target of an absolute onslaught from the day he took office, but before he took office, an absolute onslaught led by British intelligence in order to paint him as an agent of the Russian president, as an absolute traitor to the United States, in order to try to force him out of office, above all, to keep him from making exactly those kinds of agreements with those nations that Lyndon LaRouche has been proposing be the agreements made since he began formulating the new Bretton Woods idea precisely about 20 years ago. He, Lyndon LaRouche, did. Now, at the same time, this is under a gun, as Dennis mentioned at the beginning. We are now, as we might paraphrase or parody Lincoln, we are now engaged in a great test as to whether that British environmentalist, deregulated economic system, or any system so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. It cannot. It's going into yet another crash. This does not really take too much difficulty to see coming, but recently Janet Yellen, the former chairman of the Federal Reserve, saw it. We have a graphic here of the coverage on, or at least I hope we do, of the coverage in one of the major financial press of her warning last week, where she spoke at NYU and said that there was a definite danger of another financial crash, and that there were, in her words, gigantic holes in the bank regulatory system. Remember, it was only a year ago when she was leaving her post as chair of the Federal Reserve that she said that she did not foresee the possibility of another financial crash for years and years to come. I think she said in her lifetime. But here she is last week at NYU. Yellen warns of another potential financial crisis, gigantic holes in the system. That's the CNBC television headline there. Many others, officials at her level, have been warning the same thing. The culprit this time is probably corporate debt, if we could just see for a minute this other image of the size of the problem. Corporate loans, this is corporate loans alone, have risen back up to the same level as a proportion of GDP, meaning they're really much larger, that they were in 2007, immediately before the last crash. In addition, so have corporate bonds risen up to that same level, and the credit quality in them is now rapidly deteriorating. That's what Yellen was talking about in her talk at NYU, was the deterioration of that entire huge, in total about $18 trillion market of the debt of non-financial corporations in the United States. And now we have, in addition, the beginning of the first major bank bankruptcy underway, that is Deutsche Bank, which has entered into, with a big push from the German government, there has been the beginning of tentative talks for a merger, a takeover of Deutsche Bank by Commerzbank, which obviously will not occur without a big bailout from the German government. So here we go again with the beginning of major bank bankruptcies. Deutsche Bank happens to be the bank with the largest derivatives exposure in the world, of any bank in the world, and is one of the very largest in Europe. So we're back at that stage where the nations involved have to act very quickly. It's true that it doesn't take much to forecast these crashes nowadays. Since the Big Bang deregulation of the middle 1980s, we have had them very frequently. The global stock market collapses of August 1987, the deep recession of 1990, 1991, the so-called Asian crisis with another global stock market collapse in 1997, the crises of the Brazilian bonds, and then the Russian GKO bonds in 1999, the failure of the long-term capital management hedge fund in 99, which came within a very small distance of bringing down the banking system, and the collapse of the dot-com bubble, the beginning of this century, then the great financial crash in 2007. It doesn't take a lot of analysis to see these coming. The point is that they're constantly coming. It didn't take much insight to see that millions of mortgages being securitized and derivatives built up on top of them in the trillions, when millions of people couldn't pay those mortgages, that might cause a problem. And yet it caused a problem for which the banking system, the regulators were unprepared. It doesn't take much insight to see that that is happening with corporate debt right now, and that we're facing very imminently another crash of that kind, which will make further worse inroads against our economy and our standard of living and our wealth than even the last one did. So this is a countdown on which the nations really have to act. Now, I want to show you what in 2007, right before when the last great financial crash, so-called, was developing, what Lyndon LaRouche said had to be done. If we could just have the first part of this video. This was in mid-2007.
We are in one of the most exciting and dangerous periods of modern history. The present world monetary financial system will inevitably disappear soon. The question is, what will replace it? That's the issue. The international monetary system in its present form is hopelessly bankrupt. There's no way it could be simply reformed. It must be, in a sense, replaced. So what has to be done, essentially, is we have to create a new monetary system. And what I've proposed is this, that if the United States, and this is not impossible, if the United States should extend a proposal to Russia, to China, and to India to co-sponsor the formation of a new international monetary financial order, that could be done. The problem is that most nations, such as those of Western and Central Europe and other parts of the world, are not able to independently act in this way, to initiate. However, if you get the United States and Russia, which are two of the largest nations of the developed world, formerly developed world, and you combine that with China and India, which are the two Asian nations which represent the largest ration of population of the world's population, then you have a combination which can provide a protective cover for joint action together with the nations of South America, for example, and Europe and elsewhere. We have now an incalculable crisis worldwide in progress. This is not a financial crisis. This is not a financial scandal as such. This is not a scandal of any ordinary sense. This is a crisis to see who is going to run the world. Is it going to be a group of nations, or is it going to be the emerging new British Empire, or the re-emergent British Empire, which really never went away, which takes over from the United States and establishes its world rule through globalization?
Now, what you have with those powers is they are nuclear powers, all of them, both in terms of the share of their electricity and power generation, which comes from nuclear, and as producers of nuclear technologies and researchers into the new nuclear technologies through to fusion power and plasma technologies. They are spacefaring nations. China is about to, we certainly have our fingers crossed. We hope they are within weeks now of landing for the first time attempted by any nation on the far side of the moon, with all the potential that that brings for knowledge of the universe and for future development of the moon. They are all technology leaders. There is long distance, low loss, low resistance, low loss transmission of electrical power, for example. There are bridge building technologies that are fundamentally new, that have enabled the building of bridges over 30, 35 miles over the sea. These are the elements of exactly the kind of development projects in developing countries, which were the objective of the creation of the Bretton Woods system by FDR in the first place. They have broad industrial and energy production capabilities, as does the United States. So they are the nations with which we have to move. Now, the president obviously has an idea of this, but does not have an idea of the kind of deal that needs to be made. That's our job. I want to show you something else now that Lyndon, that part of that same, another fragment of that same speech in mid-2007 that LaRouche made on this issue, which he could have made yesterday in terms of what we have to do.
The present world international monetary financial system is bankrupt. There is no way in which it could be reformed on its own terms and survive. Any attempt to maintain this system would mean a complete disintegration into a new dark age comparable to what Europe experienced during the 14th century, with the collapse of some of the Lombard banks in Italy at that time. That would happen. Therefore, the solution is to establish a new international monetary financial system. That can be done on the basis of the U.S. Constitution's special provisions. Remember, the U.S. system is not a monetarist system. The U.S. system constitutionally is based on a credit system based on the constitutional authority of the United States government over the control, utterance and control of its own money. In other parts of the world, countries' financial systems have been controlled largely under the Anglo-Dutch liberal system, in which this system, through its network of private banks, so-called central banks, actually dictates and controls governments. So we've had an imperial world monetary financial system, which has been traditionally centered on the British Empire, essentially ever since 1763, February 1763. Against that, the only system which is surviving of any great significance today as the alternative is the constitutional provisions of the U.S. Constitution, which establishes the U.S. dollar as a credit mechanism of the U.S. government. That is, under our system, when it's operating, and it has not always operated that way, obviously, under our system, we generate credit through a vote in the Congress, especially the House of Representatives. The President of the United States then acts upon that authority of this federal law to utter currency as credit against the United States itself. Now, the chief function of this credit is not just to print money. The function of this credit is to supply capital funds for long-term capital investments, especially in the public sector, but spilling over into the private sector. In the public sector, large-scale infrastructure projects for the states as well as the federal government. This credit generally extends for a life period of 25 to 50 years in terms of modern economy. Therefore, we have a present world monetary financial system which does not function. However, if the United States affirms its constitution and enters into agreement with 3 other sponsoring major countries and other countries, then we can create a new international monetary financial system immediately, putting the entire existing system into bankruptcy reorganization to maintain the continuity of essential functions and to start a program of actual net economic growth and development. The hard core of this, or the long-term, would be long-term investment in basic economic infrastructure and development of the economies of various parts of the world. A cooperative set of treaty agreements of 25 to 50 years duration to create capital formation to bring the world up in the way that Roosevelt had intended had he lived at the end of the war. Therefore, the United States must be reformed in the way consistent with its own constitution by offering cooperation with other countries, especially leading countries, to establish a new world system, a new version of the old Bretton Woods system, which would provide for a recovery programs of over 25 to 50 years of long-term investment throughout the world as a whole.
Obviously, why the United States has to be the one that takes the lead, the nation that takes the lead in forming this new system. The reason is Alexander Hamilton's policies. Hamilton was the leading author of the Federalist Papers, which brought about the ratification of the Constitution and its adoption, and therefore brought about the powers that LaRouche is talking about there for both the Congress, the House of Representatives, and the executive, the president. And Hamilton himself, then as a member of the executive, was the inventor, so to speak, of credit and banking in the United States. So what is this constitutional power? Let's look at it this way. When Hamilton became Treasury Secretary, when he was named Treasury Secretary, the United States did not have sound credit. It therefore could not print currency, and he made no attempt initially to issue currency because the credit of the United States was not sound. He quickly made it sound. So to begin with, the existence of sound credit is the basis for a country issuing currency. There are very clear examples in our history of points when the United States suddenly found itself without sound credit. That is, it could not borrow at any reasonable interest rate. The Treasury could not. It could not borrow for the full value of the bonds that it was issuing. It did not have sound credit, and therefore it could not issue currency. And the way that was solved by the Lincoln administration in order to issue the greenback currency and pursue and win the Civil War for the Union, that was one of the very clearest examples of exactly what LaRouche is talking about here. If it does have sound credit, it can issue currency. If it is able to sell its bonds, if the executive, the Treasury, is able to sell its bonds to its own people and its own institutions, American people and American institutions, at face value and at relatively low, reasonable interest rates, then it has sound credit and is able to issue currency. If the American people will pay, or we're talking about America here, if the American people will pay reasonable taxes in order to secure the repayment of that bonded debt of the Treasury, then it has secure credit and is able to issue currency. This is what Hamilton referred to as the national debt being a national blessing if the means for its extinguishment had been provided for. If the country has sufficient inventiveness and its industry is sufficiently stimulated, as Hamilton did as Treasury Secretary, in order to enable its people and its companies to pay reasonable taxes and therefore secure bond issues issued by the Treasury, then it has sound credit and is able to issue currency. Most important, if this currency is used for the most productive possible uses, that is, into those areas which advance the productivity and satisfy the inventiveness of the creativity of the individual American in order to produce new forms of economic activity, new scientific and technological breakthroughs. If the currency is used in that way and the other conditions are satisfied, then the country is able to issue currency in a multiple of the bonded debt that it is capable of issuing successfully to its own people and institutions. So you have, in the case of the American history, particularly the last 100 years or so, a Treasury which clearly does issue sound credit by every measure, but that is sound debt, and nonetheless does not issue currency. And a Federal Reserve Bank, a central bank, which does not issue sound debt to anyone, which essentially orders capital to be placed in it by banks in the banking system and by the Treasury, and on that basis prints any amount of currency that it wishes. So you essentially have what we're talking here about is credit and the issuance of currency being dependent on the consent of the governed. The Treasury issues debt and therefore acquires the consent of the governed for the issuance of currency and credit. The Federal Reserve enjoys the consent only of the major Wall Street banks, and on the basis of that, it issues currency in what its policy says is unlimited amounts for any circumstance which it regards as an emergency or an extreme contingency. And we have seen in much of the last 100 years that they have been roughly in correspondence. That is, the Federal Reserve has issued roughly the volumes of currency justified by the sound borrowing of the Treasury, the issuance of the Treasury of all kinds of bonds, from war bonds to RFC bonds, all sorts of bonds which depended on the consent of the governed, the taking up of these issues in small denominations by the American public. And the Federal Reserve has generally issued currency in approximate agreement with that issuance of debt. However, not always. In the 1930s, it was a great sore point that the Federal Reserve issued far less currency for the revival of production in the United States than it should have, given the clear recovery of the reopening of industries, the ability of the Treasury to issue debt. The Federal Reserve nonetheless refused to issue the necessary amounts of currency, and there were battles over this throughout in Congress throughout the 1930s. Most recently, in the last 10 years, along with the other central banks, the Federal Reserve has taken on the authority to itself to issue far, far greater amounts of currency than anything justified by the consent of the governed in the United States, as represented by the taking up of Treasury debt. This is on the order of many trillions of dollars. The brag is made by the Federal Reserve that these many trillions of new currency that it issued to the major banks on Wall Street didn't cause much inflation because it never entered the real economy. It never went for any good purpose, let alone the most productive. It never went for any productive purpose or any economic purpose, but solely in order to steadily bail out these major banks. Therefore, it didn't cause a great deal of inflation, but it did cause the blowing up of a tremendous bubble of unpayable debt, just as the Federal Reserve has done over and over again since 1987 with the stock market crash. Every time it has then printed large amounts of money, causing the next crash, and they've come at quicker intervals and with worse effects with each one. But the fundamental principle here is that you are seeing a central bank which issues currency based on no consent of anyone except the large private banks which formed that central bank in the first place, and therefore issues that currency in what is ultimately an extremely destructive manner, as opposed to the Treasury, which at any moment, including today or tomorrow, or certainly Monday, at any moment could begin to issue currency which would be entirely sound and would be based on its own issuance of debt to the American people and American institutions, and the willingness of those Americans to place the Treasury debt they already held into a bank of the United States in order to multiply it, which was what Hamilton succeeded in doing in order to create the credit of the United States in the first place. But this is the constitutional power that LaRouche is talking about. The order, the Treasury does not issue debt on its own. It issues debt on the order of the Congress. And this has been made clear in recent government shutdown hullabaloos, that the Treasury is only able to issue debt on the basis of laws passed by the Congress. That issuance of debt is the proper basis for the issuance of successful issuance of debt is the proper basis for the issuance of currency and multiples of currency, not only by the United States, but by any country. Now, you're looking in the four powers at countries which share this capability. That is, they can quickly issue debt of their own into a new international development bank, capitalized with trillions for investment in the most necessary great projects of infrastructure and development throughout the world, particularly in the developing countries. Such a bank can easily be formed simply by these four countries and can lend money, at least in their four currencies, and then in the currencies of any additional power, such as Japan, such as South Korea, such as perhaps Germany, which also join in this new arrangement, so that there is no need for the dollar to become a universal currency for this to happen at all. And in fact, in Bretton Woods, in the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, when John Keynes led the British delegation there, the British idea was that the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, should be an international bank which would simply create its own money. and would lend that money to government. In other words, that without the consent of anyone, not even the consent of the various countries involved, let alone the consent of the governed in those countries, the IMF would invent a new currency, issue it in large amounts, and pretend to be lending it to the countries which were members of the International Monetary Fund in order to effectively put conditions on those loans and control what those countries were able to do. That's, as Lynn called it, fiat currency. That is currency characterized of a central bank system as opposed to a constitutional credit system, which involves the creation of national banks, both to create this credit and to use it. So those countries have to be triggered by the United States, by action by the United States. And that means, again, this is the kind of a deal that President Trump has not thought of. And I don't say that he's likely to think of it himself, but it's with those nations with which he came into office thinking that he should make very important economic and trade deals. And the job is ours to define and mobilize what kind of a deal actually is going to be made among those major nations, that it's going to lead to such a global development bank, and that it's going to lead to a new system of Bretton Woods with all of the characteristics which made it so successful in the period after Roosevelt's formation of it. So let me stop there and see if there are any further discussion or questions.
Okay, thank you, Paul. What I want to say is I have our microphone here in the middle of the room, so people can go to the microphone. And while you're beginning to do that, let me just simply say about the conference. Prior to the conference, we'll be doing a set of classes. It'll be a series, probably starting approximately 6 weeks before. And the intent of that will be to prepare people to participate in that conference and to come into the conference already understanding the character of our proposals. Now, we're 9 weeks away now. But I want to make sure that everybody knows that this is something that's under discussion. There'll be a conference call actually on Monday, where many of us will be talking with Helga Zepp-LaRouche about that series. But what I'd like to just say, or I think we should do here, is to take the aperture that we're in. In other words, we'll take the conceptual aperture that we're in with what Paul just outlined and try to address what he was talking about, because this is your chance, our chance to discuss how this actually happens. He just said it. So there is lack of clarity or some question, please feel free to ask it at this point. So microphone's open. Go ahead.
I would like to explore a little more about this new liberal paradigm. Is it the same thing as we know as the Washington Consensus? What is the difference among these two things? And as Dennis Speed said, that countdown has started. And Janet from the Federal Reserve, Janet Yellen, she's also predicting that we are going to face a big crash. Everybody knows about it. And what I believe that Bretton Woods financial system is one of the best choice. But in case if it does not work out, do we have a plan B, or what is going to happen then?
Well, the answer to the first question obviously is yes. They called this neoliberal paradigm for a long time the Washington Consensus. It's certainly not the Washington Consensus since President Trump was elected. So that term now has to be dropped. I haven't heard it recently. But it did refer to exactly that Washington was expected on London's behalf to enforce that neoliberal policy all over the world. But in terms of Plan B, no, those things are going to crash. I mean, a lot of that corporate debt is going to crash fairly soon. Banks are going to go. Maybe not all of them, but banks are going to go. The question is not, is there some plan B once this happens? The question is getting through it. The question is economically growing through it. You look at the fact that China grew through the 2008 crash at a rate which barely fluctuated downward at all in terms of its economic growth, its productivity growth, its fixed investment. They all just kept right on going because the Chinese government's instrument for affecting the economy is not interest rates, it's not money supply, it's credit. It's the creation and supply of credit, particularly through its major commercial banks, into specific areas of development of infrastructure and the economy. That's the way they have not had a recession or any of these sort of crashes for 35 years. So there is a way to grow right through these. They also, by the way, have bank separation. They have Glass-Steagall bank separation in China since 1994. Their banks are not involved in the international derivatives markets to any significant extent at all. So there is a way to grow through such a crash. And another indication of this, a report that just came out from the International Labor Organization a few days ago, which directly addressed the fact that only in China had not only real wages continued to grow since the crash of 2008, but the share of wages, of remuneration of labor, the share of the GDP, which is made up of remuneration of labor, had continued to grow in China. That's actually far more important than any growth in real wages. The share that labor was taking, that work was taking in the form of payment of gross domestic product continued to grow in China, unlike anywhere else in the world. And the authors of that report say they call this the neoliberalism's intellectual capture of economic policy making across a wide range of countries is resulting in the exclusion of most wage earners from the gains of economic growth. But they say this was not inevitable. China, after all, has achieved rapid wage growth. So how did they do it? They did it precisely by this policy of controlling the economy by issuance of credit to the most vital sectors, the most vital projects, the use of the public commercial banks in order to do that, in harness with the People's Bank of China, in order to do that. That's what we are looking for. That's plan A as well as plan B. Not that we somehow keep the banks up with more capital buffers and so on and so forth, but that we reestablish banking separation right away, Glass-Steagall right away. That's part of the Bretton Woods system originally. It's part of the new Bretton Woods system that we have to form. We reestablish that immediately to protect enough commercial banks that this kind of credit can flow through them as well as around them into the real economy and into the development of new productivity and new technologies. That gets us through such a crash of speculative values. That could have worked if Glass-Steagall had been in place before the 2008 crash.
Okay. Next question. Go ahead.
My name's Ernie. Question is this, that the corporate debt sector is an unprecedented, debt. And my question is that it's a little more clear why you would have this massive debt of, in terms of speculative activity, like we had with the mortgages and the securitized mortgages in 2007. But companies like, General Electric, General Motors, presumably they're producing something, real material wealth, and they would have, you would think they would achieve a profit from that. However, evidently it's not the case. It sounds like the speculative economy is spilling over into that corporate sector, but I'd like you to elaborate why that is, why you have this unprecedented debt in the corporate sector, especially at this time.
Well, those two companies didn't just spill over, it took over. Um, you know, General Motors has been for some time a financial corporation with an auto company on the side. And General Electric, for even longer, has been a financial company with a lot of various more or less productive divisions on the side. These are recently companies which have poured between them something like $60 billion in just the last couple of years into buying back their own stock. In other words, financial engineering. So the speculative financialization, these companies have been financialized some time ago. The speculative side of them has been brought out and made dominant to the point where they are scarcely productive, deserving to be called productive corporations at this time. We're going to have a broadcast on this next Friday on our weekly LaRouche Pack webcast, focusing on the ongoing shutdown of plants in the Midwest, and there may be 4 or 5 more. The General Motors is imminently going to shut down, in addition to the 7 it's already announced. This is a real crisis across the middle of the country, and one which comes directly out of, well, of course, in this case, these companies have already gone through bankruptcy once 10 years ago, and then been made essentially tax-free, and since then, and still owe the government a good deal of money as a result of that bankruptcy bailout that they got, and instead have been borrowing more money in order to buy their own stock, and achieving the wonderful result of their stock dropping substantially while they were buying it, so that in addition to everything else, they were losing money on the stock that they were buying by borrowing money, and so on and so forth. These are not, this is the kind of thing that has produced this corporate debt bubble. What has really been the cause of it has been the issuance to the major banks of about $15 trillion in new money, new currency since 2008 by the major central banks, which have blown up this corporate debt bubble, among other bubbles, but this one has become the biggest, and as Yellen and everybody else recognize now, by far the most dangerous of within the so-called everything bubble is that corporate bubble, and it's likely to bring it down.
Okay. I also should just indicate that the Executive Intelligence Review that's outside has a set of articles you're going to want to look at, specifically some things from Helga, a section which is about what's gone on in France, the visit that Dennis Small just did in Portugal and Spain. Many of you heard him speak here about that. Helga's discussion about the mass strike process and the government crisis, and the idea of new paradigm or economic chaos and war. So this is in the back. You want to make sure that you pick this up. Now, I actually have something, Paul, I want to raise in this context. People are familiar with a speech that was given by Dwight Eisenhower, in which the end of his term in office, in 1959, early 60, or actually that period, he talked about being wary of the military industrial complex. Today, you have a sort of military monetary complex in which clearly we've talked, Helga, specifically about stopping geopolitics, but also recognizing that you've got massive industrial deals with military deals, such as, for example, BAE's deal, the Al Yamama deal in the case of the Saudis, but there are many, many others of these. You can take any number of things. What I'd like you to tell us is this. See, in contrast to that, we've called over time, over decades, for crash programs involving advanced technologies, such as, for example, the SDI, which we did not call for primarily initially as a military program. It was a laser defense program. It responded, but we were also talking about the retooling of the workforce of the assembly lines then, using laser machine tools. And when Lynn ran in 1984, he did a whole program just on that idea of a new economic platform of that period. If you could give us an idea of how something like, for example, a crash program, whether it's thermonuclear fusion or a combination of things, we've talked about them also with the fourth law. How would you, this design we have, you've laid out concerning a new Bretton Woods and this idea, how does something like that come into being as a form of negotiation, well, not negotiation, a form of a combination among those powers? How would that look, and how would that affect this issue of geopolitics?
Well, I think that, Helga has discussed this a great deal, that if the initial impetus to, let us take, for example, the Lake Chad recharging the Project Transaqua, if we take that as something on which the four powers could collaborate from the standpoint of, and in particular, they all now are, or at least the United States, Russia, China, and India, all have a focus on Africa. Russia has recently been talking about railroad building in Africa and discussing that with countries there, as well as, of course, providing, it's the leading provider of nuclear power technology in the world. It wants to provide that to Africa. India has had a focus of its Make in India program, a focus on investing in Africa and exporting capital goods to Africa for a long time. So this is clearly something which is a completely transformative project. The future of Africa really depends on it, as the president of Nigeria has recently very eloquently said on 2 occasions at least. It's an extraordinarily large undertaking with hundreds of tributaries of the Congo River having being partially dammed in order to take a fraction of the flow of each of those hundreds of tributaries and channel it through a canal and eventually through an existing river into Lake Chad. This is something like we talked about the North American Water and Power Alliance for water for the desertifying west of North America, but for the desertifying Sahel of Africa and the all of the effects of terrorism and poverty which have been caused there as a result of the disappearance of Lake Chad. If those countries were to take that as the first project of an international development bank set up for the purpose, set up under the treaty agreement that LaRouche is talking about, of a new Bretton Woods, a 4-power agreement for a new Bretton Woods. If that bank were to undertake that as its first objective, then those countries, for purposes of producing productivity and really lifting up out of poverty a whole area of the world, would be making economic investments, one in which their companies could also participate in a profitable way, but one in which the nations would be creating credit for the purpose of productivity, not of profit. If they did that, if that were their initial impetus, then obviously everything that they then did vis-a-vis each other would take on a changed character. And we've made this, I think, most clear in terms of the issue of the very volatile issue now of Central American immigration into the United States, the issue of Mexico, and the friendship that has developed between President Trump and the new president of López Obrador of Mexico, such that a project under the rubric of a plan called Remain in Mexico, a project for the development of railroads, ports, power, water, and other infrastructure in order to create relatively prosperity in those nations rather than the desperation to leave, that could be done, as Keisha Rogers said in her campaign, by a cooperative project of the United States, Mexico, and China. And effectively, that's what Lopez Obrador is proposing at this point. And he talked to President Trump about it just a couple of days ago and reported that it was a good conversation. So that would be another such, essentially something which would be trampling over the dead body of NAFTA, and instead making a North American Belt and Road Initiative, as Keisha called for it. And then the relationship instantly would be changed between the United States and China, because there would then be associated investments in other kinds of major projects in North America, all the way up perhaps to the Bering Strait crossing, and also high-speed railroad building in the United States. There would be a lot of other areas where the credit would be suggested to go. That would change the calculus of this very, very rough, almost abusive deal, which the president is trying to make with China, because he regards China as a power with which he should make deals. That would change the character of it. That kind of thing removes the geopolitical spillovers, which then the neocons rush into, in the way that they have rushed into this trade conflict between the United States, which Trump clearly is invested in. They've rushed into this in order to try to make it a imminent run-up to war between the United States and China. An issue of this absurd discussion the other day by one of the senior military officers of whether the United States would now win a war with China or not, as if there were any intention of a war on either side. The neocons have rushed immediately into this in order to treat China, as well as Russia, as a power with which we're likely to go to war sometime in the near future, and therefore we have to beat them down in every conceivable way that we can, while building up our own military. And you know, the president said he wanted to reduce the next military budget. The neocons and some of the military chiefs immediately went after him on that. And how in the hell is it that it takes us $750 billion to somehow retain the ability to fight a war with China, which is spending perhaps $70 to $80 billion on their defense budget, and Russia even less, considerably less? How are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because the major defense contracting companies themselves and the consulting companies are financialized themselves and make tremendous leverage of yield, of profit yield on these contracts. And also, these consultants might as well be environmentalists for all the additional years that they add on to the production of any significant military system. They might as well be environmentalists going into court against it, because they make it take forever and cost immense amounts. And so, you know, there is a military, industrial, financial complex at work that Eisenhower may have had a glimpse of back when he was talking in 1960. But this would immediately begin to change, and the leverage that these kind of neocon circles have in this sort of thing, in making another major country very suddenly into a total, absolute enemy, a likely war opponent in the near future. This leverage would immediately start to diminish, and would diminish quickly, if these kinds of joint investments were going on. The United States has recently formed, by legislation of Congress, the BUILD Act, has potentially formed a $60 billion international development bank, which could be a vehicle directly for this kind of treaty agreement for a true international development bank. if it's used in that way. So the potential is there.
Okay, very good. So the next question, and if I also have a question by somebody that had to go, and I'll read that in a moment. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Patrick from Connecticut.
Hi there.
Paul, I gave up all my commitments today to be here, and that's very unusual.
And knowing you, Patrick, I know you have a lot.
Well, what I have to say is something that is crucial, because it's like having a concert and nobody shows up. You have all the music and everything. So what I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to bring people to and have seminars, okay? And what everything like what you're teaching of how we go into the future, this is what they need is uh, a plan on what they can do to bring it together, instead of like all this gibberish from the newspapers and all that. What I'm trying to say is, I did an experiment when I was coming here, and I was at the railroad station, and there was, people that were gathering, here and there. So this one group had about 4 people. So I went up to the group and I said, "Hi, my name is so and so." Okay. And they looked at me and I says, "No, I'm just breaking the ice." I said, "This is what we don't have. People talking to people." Before I knew, I got them interested in the LaRouche pack. They were from the Philippines, but they were amazed because they were so like shocked that I would go, somebody would come up to them, and they were very, I mean, that made my day. So what I'm trying to do now is I have all the elected officials that didn't get elected. They lost in Connecticut, and I'm putting together a meeting with them and the LaRouche pack. So the LaRouche pack tells them this is what we're trying to do. So these people have the influence over people. So they bring the people to a seminar, and we teach them what they need to know. That's on the agenda. January 15th. It's going to be our first seminar in Greenwich, Connecticut.
So this was
That's great. I have nothing to add to that. Now that we've heard from the old so-and-so.
okay. Go ahead if you have a question. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Paul. My name is Donna. I'm from Connecticut. I'm Patrick's sidekick. He has such a gifted talent of just walking up to someone and talking, saying anything, and everybody loves him. So I'm hoping to be part of his educational plan on the LaRouche pack and the 4 powers. And I feel that the very first time that I learned about the LaRouche pack was when I met Patrick in front of the Darien post office. I really feel that it was a huge blessing in my life, because it really gave me hope, and it gives everyone hope. I mean, who learns about it, as I think. But anyway, I want to ask you to bear with me because I'm new at this and I have a question, and I don't know if the 2 things that I have in the question actually go together. So this is my question. Through the creation of credit, through a banking separation by reestablishing a new Bretton Woods system. Is this system a tool to bring back the gold standard, or is the gold standard created another way?
This system is not a goal to bring back the gold standard. The Bretton Woods system that Roosevelt created in 44 was not a gold standard system. In fact, one of the very first things he did 12 years before that was to take the United States off the gold standard. And at the time that he did it, his cabinet members had a meeting and thought he was crazy. One of them said it was the end of Western civilization as we know it. But he pushed through because, in a simple sense, there's the extreme that I discussed, where instead of credit, that is money, our currency, dollars, instead of credit being created newly on the basis of the consent of the governed, that is by the Treasury acting by law of the Congress, demonstrating that it can successfully sell its debt to the American people at reasonable rates and American institutions at reasonable rates at full value. Instead of that, I was describing the other extreme where a Federal Reserve simply arrogates the right to print US currency, to issue new dollars without the consent of anybody except 20 banks on Wall Street, who are its creators. But then there's the other extreme, which I didn't discuss, which is involved in the gold standard. And that is when a country enslaves itself to the amount of gold that it owns, and in particular to the current value of the amount of gold that it owns, and says that the amount of its currency that can be in circulation is only exactly as much as the value of the gold that it owns, the gold standard. Now, when Roosevelt was organizing in the 30s already for what was called the Inter-American Bank, that never actually got formed, but it was the run-up to the World Bank that was formed as part of the Bretton Woods system. It was the principle that he was aiming at. He wanted to make such a development bank with the South American countries. When he was doing that, his administration was acting to get those countries off the gold standard because most of them were on it. Most of them, not only was it deflationary, that is, all of a sudden their money would tend to disappear. What happened if they were on the gold standard and all of a sudden it was a huge new discovery of gold somewhere? The price of gold then suddenly dropped, or production was stopped at 3 mines at once, and price of gold then suddenly went up. The amount of currency they could have would be going like this, would be fluctuating constantly, and they couldn't raise it. They couldn't increase it, and therefore those governments couldn't invest credit in the development and productivity of their own economy because they were limited by the amount of gold that they had. A gold reserve system is nothing like that. I don't think I need to go into a detailed description. I indicated it's when countries, typically at the end of a year, if they have a big imbalance of trade, one has a surplus, the other has a deficit. The one that has a surplus wants to settle it up. I don't want to hold all this currency. I'd rather give it back to you where it came from and you give me gold. That's how a gold reserve system operates. It makes very small changes in the value of a currency, very small over time. So the country can rely on the value of its currency remaining essentially stable under a gold reserve system. But the main thing is that it is free to the extent that it can issue new, that its treasury can issue new debt, and it is successfully bought by its own people and institutions. It is free to create more currency, and if it makes the right kind of investments with it, even multiples of more currency, and therefore create more economic activity, more productivity. That's what I mean when I say it is Hamilton's idea was that credit exists and currency exists by the consent of the governed. And in opposition to that, you have the world, Keynes's idea of a new World Bank by the consent of nobody. He was just going to print currency and issue it to countries all over the world, and they would somehow have to use it. Or the Federal Reserve, which by no one's consent, except for 20 banks on Wall Street, prints trillions and trillions and trillions in the last 10 years and uses it to buy bad securities from these same banks. It's like a corrupt deal is all it is. So they're creating all that trillions for a corrupt deal with some banks on Wall Street. That is creation of credit and currency without the consent of the governed, which is insisted on in the British system. We don't need the consent of the governed in order to create our currency. That's what Hamilton defied and created the alternative.
Thank you very much.
We had a question from a student who was here but had to go. It was this: under Bretton Woods, currencies were in relates to what we just talked about. Under Bretton Woods, currencies were fixed in relative value. If one country's economy is growing much more strongly than another, might it make sense for its currency to gain value? Vice versa, if a country is having a terrible economic crisis, should its currency stay high? Are fixed exchange rates unfair for this reason? How could this be addressed over time? Yeah, that was the question.
Yeah, it's a good question because it's absolutely true that these successful investments and real growth and rapid growth by one country do then put it in a position to accelerate its productivity and its growth still further. Why should that be held back by a fixed value? I mean, the Bretton Woods system is sometimes referred to as a fixed exchange rate system, but in fact they were not fixed, they were stable. That is, the currencies were able to change their value relative to each other in a gradual fashion from year to year. And really the operation of the gold reserve, which I briefly described, tends to have that effect anyway, because the country that you described that is growing rapidly will probably also be trading with the other country at a surplus, and therefore that country will be accumulating the currency of the other country. If we say it's dollars in each case, it means the rapidly growing country will be accumulating dollars that will be being paid to its companies in the course of the year, and those dollars will wind up typically in the national bank or central bank of that surplus country. And at periodic intervals, that bank can go to the national bank of the deficit country and say, I have all this currency of yours. I don't want to keep it. Here, you take it and give me gold. And under a gold reserve system, that transaction does take place. And if the surplus country wants it to, it does take place. And under the impact of those, there will be changes in the relative value of the currency. They'll be slow and gradual. It'll be stable. There were bands of permitted in the Bretton Woods system. There were bands of permitted variation among the currencies. They tended to be 1% in either direction, but those bands could also be periodically changed and made wider or moved up or moved down, so that kind of change in value representing real productive advance, real progress, that kind of change did take place.
Okay.
Hi, Paul. It's Sylvia. Just from doing a lot of the organizing with youth or on the phones, and since you brought up the Keynes, fraud around the previous Bretton Woods system, I just want to clarify because there's a lot of talk now about a new Bretton Woods, but coming from the mouths of people like Varoufakis, Alejandro Ocasio, and we know that these people are not real, but just for the audience to know, clarifying what is the difference with what they're saying, just so people don't fall into that trap of thinking.
Well, I mean, I think I've already said it in terms of, you could answer it in terms of what would be the effect of letting people set up this kind of a Keynesian new Bretton Woods that they are talking about. You know, the effect would be that they would probably try to do it with cryptocurrencies, with electronic currencies. They would probably try to require that those currencies be invested in solar and wind and other green technologies. I mean, Will Wirtz went through a number of the effects, but to me, it's more important, the basic distinction that I've already made, that they are not talking about a new Bretton Woods system which would create credit by the consent of the governed of any country, but rather it would say, no, we don't need the consent of the governed anywhere. We have a scheme. And under this scheme, we're going to create a new global currency. And our scheme is going to allow us to print so and so much of this new global currency. And we're going to then make sure that it gets invested in certain kinds of green investments and so on and so forth. They are saying that as Keynes did in his proposal in 1944, that idea is, no, you don't need the consent of the governed anywhere in any country to invent a currency and print as much of it as you like. Hamilton proved, and it is in the success of the United States as an economy, especially through the beginning of the 20th century, and then again through the middle of the 20th century, in that golden period, Hamilton has been proved correct that when credit is created and therefore currency based on that credit is created with the consent of the governed, when you demonstrate that that government has the ability to issue reasonable, sound, low interest bonds to its own people and institutions and have them successfully taken up, that country is in a position to make that credit into currency. And that is exactly what the designers of the congressmen who passed the law that allowed the greenbacks to be circulated to save the Union in the Civil War. That is exactly what they said. They said the bonds of the Treasury that we're issuing in this war are a loan by the people to the government at interest. The greenbacks that the Treasury is printing are a loan by the people to the government without interest. They are essentially the same thing. That's what they said. They are both based on the consent of the governed, because a currency is really a loan by the people to the government. And you notice that LaRouche said that in that second excerpt that I played for you. He talked about the United States constitutional system by law from the Congress enabling the executive to issue currency as a debt against the government. That's what Lynn said in there. And that it also tells you that it is being issued with the consent of the governed. And that makes all the difference in the world, because then, as Hamilton proved, you can establish the credit of a country. You can, at the same time, use it in order to stimulate the creativity and the inventiveness of the companies, of the individuals within the country, in order to produce the most rapid progress.
I think we're going to go to conclusion at this point. And as we do, Paul, I want to ask you, taking up the last thing that you were saying, because you just made the point that the loan is actually from the people of the United States. Of course, that's because the value of the economy comes from the workforce, the productivity of the workforce, and the ideas, discoveries, and inventions that they make. I wonder if you could say something as you're concluding about the relationship between upgrading the physical economy using the most advanced scientific principles to do that, which of course is what we were trying to do back in particularly that period of 1980 through 83, where we had achieved our bill, the McCormick bill on thermonuclear fusion, or a 20-year crash program, Apollo style, to make thermonuclear fusion the major technologies by the 1990s, and so on. But that we had this idea of changing the United States, and that the currency system, and of course, Lynn then talked back then about a new international development bank. These were much earlier formulations. But I wonder if you would say something so people have an idea of why the growth of one country and the value or relative values of currencies and so on is not a problem in a system that's not dominated by stagnation, by scientific stagnation, and why it is that this system we're talking about can end that problem.
Well, I think it's demonstrated over and over again in U.S. history. There's a recent example in a very different country, which I think is really illustrates this, because it's not a country that's considered to have a tremendously robust economy, a very strong currency, any of those things. But nonetheless, it's a large developing country, specifically Egypt, which conceived the idea a few years ago of doubling the Panama Canal. I think, the Suez Canal. I think most people know about this, and how rapidly they did it. And that despite the naysayers who said, oh, well, there won't be traffic for ships to be going through in both directions at once, after a few years, the Suez Canal traffic has indeed greatly increased, and the productivity is now paying back in Egypt. But how did they do it? They issued bonds which were exclusively to be bought by Egyptians, and exclusively to be bought with Egyptian pounds, Egyptian currency, by Egyptians only. And in 1 week, they raised the entire sum in bonds which was necessary in order to carry out that project of now this appeared to be a country without particular currency reserves. It appeared to be that is foreign currency reserves or strong other forms of currency reserves or gold reserves. It appeared to be a country without a great deal of investment capital sloshing around, like the Wall Street is always talking about the trillions that are sloshing around here and there. It appeared to be without any of these things. But just as we did with the greenbacks in 1861, which saved our nation, Egypt did with that Suez Canal issue in 1 week. And on that basis, we're able to issue the currency to get the project done. So it's all the potential, the ability to do it is always there. There's no such thing as a country which somehow just can't create any credit at all on its own. The ability to do it, I mean, there might be in the case of a country which is completely destroyed by war, but even our own Hussein, who actually gave that suggestion to people in the Egyptian government back then, has now developed the Phoenix Plan for the redevelopment of Yemen, even in the condition that Yemen has been driven into by the genocidal war there. Nonetheless, that involves this kind of, excuse me, my phone is ringing. That involves this kind of issuance of credit, even by the government in Sana'a. It's always possible to do it. And the United States, in spite of the fact that it has financialized and has not made these kind of investments since the Apollo project, and therefore has not developed fusion energy, nonetheless, there have been technological breakthroughs which are very significant, like maglev rail, for example, which have occurred outside the United States during that period of time, which the United States could very rapidly develop and generate the credit in order to develop those things now. It's always available, and it's even more available for the United States through this kind of treaty arrangement with other major powers that Lynn is talking about. But when he says that the United States has to take the lead now, that can be seen as a simple function of the fact that there is a great deal more U.S. Treasury debt outstanding than that of any other country, and that Treasury debt is completely sound. We can issue more of it at any time, and it immediately gets bought at very low rates. And in fact, increasing share of it is being bought by Americans and American institutions in the recent period. So as the Federal Reserve is finally selling some of their huge holdings of it off, Americans are buying it. So the possibility is always there to turn that immediately through a crash program into the breakthroughs in a new technology, such as the development of small modular nuclear reactors, which may in fact be closer than we thought until recently, and which is an intention of the Energy Department and the Trump administration, or the development of working prototypes of fusion reactors.
Okay, we want to thank you for that, Paul. And we're going to end our session. We don't want your wife to kill you or whoever it was that called you on the phone.
Do you want me to tell you? No. Well, it wasn't you, Dennis.
All right, so let's just join me in thanking Paul for being here with us today.
And thank you for letting me do it.
Sure. We'll see you at the conference.
Actually,